A doctor experimented on his patients in secret. Then AK-9 led investigators to his hidden lab. In the sterile halls of the prestigious Broadview Hospital, Dr. Victor Henshaw strode confidently, his white coat billowing behind him. Respected by his peers for his brilliance, he was also feared for his icy demeanor and piercing gaze. Nurses and orderlies scurried out of his way as he made his rounds, checking on his patients, the ones he handpicked for his secret endeavors. Unbeknownst to all, deep within the hospital's abandoned East Wing, Dr. Henshaw had created a hidden laboratory. There, he conducted illegal and unethical experiments on society's most vulnerable. The homeless, the undocumented, those who wouldn't be missed. In the name of scientific advancement, he pushed the boundaries, heedless of the suffering he inflicted. As he finished his rounds and headed to his office, a timid knock sounded at the door. "Come in," he called impatiently. A young nurse, Elena Morales, entered hesitantly. Though kind and compassionate with patients, she always felt uneasy around the foreboding doctor. "What is it?" Dr. Henshaw snapped, not looking up from his computer. "It's Mr. Jonah from room 310, Elena said. "He was supposed to be discharged today, but he's gone. His room is empty." Dr. Henshaw's head jerked up, his eyes narrowing. Jonah, one of his test subjects. This could ruin everything. "He probably left against medical advice," the doctor said dismissively. "Notify security and social work. I'm sure he'll turn up." Elena nodded and hurried out, but a nagging suspicion lingered in her mind. This wasn't the first patient to disappear recently. Miles away, in the small town of Millfield, Officer Sam Carter of the K-9 unit was enjoying a rare quiet shift with his patrol dog, Max. The German Shepherd sat alert in the passenger seat as they cruised along the rural roads surrounding the town. Suddenly, Max's ears perked up and he let out a low whine. "What is it, boy?" Sam asked, slowing the car. Max continued to whine, his nose pressed against the window. Trusting his dog's instincts, Sam pulled over near a dense patch of woods. No sooner had he opened the door than Max bounded out, racing into the undergrowth. "Max, heel!" Sam called, sprinting after him. He crashed through the brush, following the flash of the dog's tail up ahead. After several minutes, Sam burst into a clearing and stumbled to a stop. Max stood rigid, hackles raised, staring at a dilapidated cabin nearly reclaimed by the forest. Sam moved forward warily, one hand on his holster. He nudged the door open with his foot, recoiling at the stench of chemicals and rot. Max entered the cabin, nose to the ground. He led Sam to a trapdoor hidden beneath a moldy rug. Gun drawn, the officer heaved open the hatch, revealing a rickety staircase descending into darkness. Heart pounding, he called for backup and cautiously made his way down, Max close at his heels. At the bottom, Sam fumbled for a light switch, his breath catching as the room flickered into view. Rusted cages lined one wall, some still containing the remains of animals. Exam tables were strewn with surgical tools and vials of unknown substances. In the center, a drain was crusted with the unmistakable brown of old blood. Max whined and pawed at a tattered lab coat hanging by the stairs. As Sam examined it with a sense of growing dread, he saw the embroidered name, Dr. Victor Henshaw. By the next day, word of the grisly discovery had spread through Millfield like wildfire. Neighbors gathered on street corners, whispering about the horrors that had been lurking in their midst. At the local diner, patrons traded increasingly outlandish theories over cups of bitter coffee. Melanie Jacobs, editor of the town's weekly newspaper, Millfield Gazette, listened to the chatter with keen interest. Ever since Officer Carter had called her with the tip about the cabin, she had been chasing down leads, determined to uncover the truth behind the disturbing laboratory. "I bet it was aliens," declared Earl Hammond, the diner's grizzled cook, "probably experimenting on animals to learn about our biology." Maggie Novak, the motherly waitress, rolled her eyes as she refilled his mug. "It's obviously the government. Secret military testing. My cousin knows a guy who said they've been developing mind control drugs." Melanie shook her head and turned back to her notes. She couldn't afford to get caught up in speculation. She needed facts, hard evidence to expose the culprit behind the twisted experiments. And all signs were pointing to Broadview Hospital, the looming institution on the edge of Millfield. Across town, Dr. Henshaw paced in his office, his carefully cultivated composure cracking. The cabin had been his first laboratory, long abandoned when he transferred his operation to the hospital. But he had been careless, leaving traces behind. He had underestimated the tenacity of small-town law enforcement and their mutts. Now, everything he had worked for was at risk. He needed to act quickly, destroy any remaining evidence and silence any witnesses. Starting with the troublesome patient, Jonah. A plan formed in Dr. Henshaw's brilliant, twisted mind. He reached for the phone to summon his most loyal orderly, a man who shared his disdain for the dregs of society. Together, they would ensure that the truth would never come to light. As he dialed, Dr. Henshaw's lips curled into a cold smile. He was not about to let his life's work be undone by the meddling of inferior minds. Elena couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong at Broadview Hospital. As she went about her duties, she began to notice a disturbing pattern. The patients who disappeared were always the most vulnerable, those without family or stable homes. And they all seemed to be under Dr. Henshaw's care. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Elena started discreetly gathering information. She made copies of patient files, jotting down notes about their conditions and treatment plans. In the privacy of her apartment, she pored over the documents, searching for any clues that might explain their disappearances. Late one night, as she sipped her third cup of coffee, a name jumped out at her from the jumble of medical jargon. Daniel Cross, a former detective, listed as the emergency contact for one of the missing patients. Elena recognized the name instantly. Daniel was an old friend, someone she had always admired for his integrity and dedication to justice. With trembling hands, she reached for her phone and dialed his number. After several rings, a gruff voice answered, thick with sleep. "Hello, Daniel, it's Elena, from Broadview Hospital. I'm sorry to call so late, but I need your help. I think something terrible is happening here." There was a pause, then the sound of rustling sheets. "Tell me everything," Daniel said, his voice suddenly alert. As Elena recounted her suspicions and the evidence she had gathered, Daniel listened intently, his mind racing. He had left the police force years ago, disillusioned by the corruption and bureaucracy. But the instinct to protect the innocent had never left him. "Meet me tomorrow," he said when she had finished. "Bring everything you have. We'll get to the bottom of this together." Hanging up, Daniel stared into the darkness of his bedroom, a familiar sense of purpose stirring in his chest. He knew all too well the evil that men like Dr. Henshaw were capable of, and he would stop at nothing to bring them to justice. Across town, in the depths of the hospital, Dr. Henshaw prepared for his most audacious experiment yet. Jonah, strapped to an exam table, struggled weakly against his restraints, his eyes wide with terror. The doctor loomed over him, a syringe filled with a glowing green liquid in his hand. "Don't worry," Dr. Henshaw said, his voice devoid of empathy. "You're about to become part of something greater than yourself, a sacrifice for the advancement of science." As the needle pierced Jonah's skin, his screams echoed through the hidden laboratory, unheard by the slumbering hospital above. The next morning, Elena and Daniel met at a small cafe near the hospital. Huddled over cups of strong black coffee, they spread out the files and notes Elena had gathered. Daniel scanned the documents, his brow furrowed in concentration. "There's definitely a pattern here," he murmured. "All these patients have similar profiles. No family, no stable housing. Easy targets." Elena nodded, her hands tightly clasped around her mug. "And they all vanished without a trace. No discharge papers, no transfer orders. It's like they never existed." Daniel leaned back, his mind churning. "We need to find a way to get inside that hospital. See what Henshaw is up to." As they plotted their next move, a commotion erupted outside the cafe. A disheveled man stumbled down the sidewalk, his hospital gown hanging off his gaunt frame. He was mumbling incoherently, his eyes wild with panic. Elena gasped, "That's Jonah, one of the missing patients." She and Daniel rushed outside, trying to approach the man gently. "Jonah? It's Elena, from the hospital. You're safe now. We want to help you." Jonah recoiled, his hands held up as if to ward them off. "No, no more. I won't go back," he shouted. "The doctor, he did things. Terrible things." Daniel's heart clenched at the raw terror in Jonah's voice. He had seen that look before in the eyes of the most traumatized victims. "Jonah, I know you're scared, but we need your help to stop him. Can you tell us what happened?" Haltingly, Jonah began to recount his ordeal. The secret lab, the painful experiments, the other patients who had not survived. As he spoke, Elena and Daniel exchanged horrified glances. They gently led Jonah to a nearby bench, urging him to rest while they called for medical assistance and protection from the authorities. Elena wrapped a blanket around his trembling shoulders, fighting back tears. Daniel paced, his hands clenched into fists. Henshaw had to be stopped before he could harm anyone else. And Daniel knew he would need all the evidence he could gather to bring the doctor to justice. A few blocks away, Officer Sam Carter and Max were following up on another lead. An anonymous tip had come in about suspicious activity at an abandoned warehouse near the edge of town. As they approached the derelict building, Max suddenly stiffened, his nose to the ground. With a bark, the dog took off, racing around the perimeter of the warehouse. Sam followed, his heart pounding. As they rounded the corner, he spotted what had caught Max's attention: a trail of blood, leading from a side door into the dense woods beyond. News of Jonah's escape spread quickly through the halls of Broadview Hospital. Nurses and orderlies whispered in hushed tones, casting nervous glances at Dr. Henshaw as he stalked the corridors, his face a mask of cold fury. In the cafeteria, a group of medical students huddled over their laptops, scrolling through the latest posts on the Millfield Gazette's website. Melanie Jacobs had wasted no time in publishing Jonah's harrowing account, along with her own blistering expose of the hospital's dark secrets. "I can't believe this was happening right under our noses," said Leo, a wide-eyed first-year resident. "How could we not have known?" His classmate Jada shook her head. "We were all too busy trying to impress Henshaw, too afraid to question him." As the article made its rounds, the atmosphere in the hospital grew tense. Staff members eyed each other with suspicion, wondering who among them might have been complicit in the doctor's crimes. Patients began to refuse treatment, demanding to be transferred to other facilities. In his office, Dr. Henshaw paced like a caged animal. The police had already been to question him, alerted by the meddling nurse and her ex-cop friend. He had played the part of the concerned physician, insisting that Jonah was delusional, a troubled man spinning wild tales. But he knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. He needed to act fast, destroy the evidence in his lab, dispose of any remaining test subjects, and then disappear, start fresh somewhere new. He had connections, funds hidden away for just such an emergency. But first, he had to deal with Elena and Daniel. They were the biggest threat to his plans, the ones who had brought his world crashing down. He picked up the phone, dialing a number he had hoped never to use. "It's me," he said, his voice cold. "I have a problem that needs to be eliminated." Miles away, in the woods behind the warehouse, Officer Sam Carter followed the trail of blood, Max at his heels. The dog's nose was to the ground, his tail stiff with anticipation. As they moved deeper into the trees, the trail grew thicker, the coppery scent hanging heavy in the air. Sam's heart raced as he pushed aside branches, dreading what he might find. And then, in a small clearing, he saw it. A body, torn and bloody, sprawled across the forest floor. Sam recognized the white lab coat immediately. It was one of the doctors from Broadview Hospital. Daniel and Elena sat in a quiet corner of the Millfield Public Library, poring over the files they had gathered. The building was nearly empty, just a few patrons browsing the stacks, the hush broken only by the occasional turning of a page. Elena rubbed her eyes, exhausted from the long hours of research. "There has to be something here," she murmured. "Something that ties Henshaw directly to the experiments." Daniel nodded, his jaw clenched tight. They had been combing through the documents for days, looking for any shred of hard evidence to take to the authorities. But Henshaw had been careful, covering his tracks with meticulous precision. As Elena reached for another file, a shadow fell across the table. She looked up to see a tall, broad-shouldered man looming over them. His face was hard, his eyes cold. "Daniel Cross?" the man asked, his voice a low rumble. Daniel stood slowly, his hand drifting towards the gun he still carried out of habit. "Who's asking?" The man smiled, a humorless twist of his lips. "Dr. Henshaw sends his regards." In a flash, the man lunged forward, his fist connecting with Daniel's jaw. Daniel stumbled back, stars exploding behind his eyes. Elena screamed, scrambling to her feet. The attacker turned on her, his eyes glinting with malice. But Daniel was already moving, tackling the man from behind. They crashed into a bookshelf, sending volumes tumbling to the floor. Elena grabbed a heavy tome, bringing it down on the attacker's head with all her strength. He slumped to the ground, unconscious. Daniel stood, wiping blood from his split lip. "We need to get out of here. Henshaw knows we're on to him." Elena nodded, her heart racing. She scooped up the files, stuffing them into her bag. Together, they fled the library, looking over their shoulders for any sign of pursuit. At the edge of the woods, Officer Sam Carter stared down at the body of the doctor, his mind reeling. He recognized the man from his visits to the hospital, a young resident named Dr. Patel. Max whined, pawing at the ground near the body. Sam knelt down, his eyes widening as he saw what the dog had uncovered. A small, leather-bound notebook, spattered with blood. With trembling hands, Sam flipped through the pages. It was a journal, filled with Dr. Patel's neat, precise handwriting. And as he read, a chilling picture began to emerge. Dr. Patel had been working with Henshaw, assisting in the illegal experiments. But as the tests grew more brutal, more unethical, he had begun to have doubts. The final entry was dated just 2 days ago. "I can't do this anymore," Dr. Patel had written. "What we're doing is wrong. I'm going to confront Henshaw, tell him I'm going to the authorities. I have to make this right." Sam's heart sank as he looked at the body, the pieces falling into place. Henshaw had silenced his own colleague, a man who had dared to stand up to him. He reached for his radio, his voice grim. "This is Officer Carter. I need backup at my location. We have a homicide on our hands." The Millfield community was in chaos. The revelation of Dr. Henshaw's crimes had shattered the trust they had placed in Broadview Hospital, the institution that was supposed to heal and protect them. On Main Street, a crowd gathered outside the offices of the Millfield Gazette, clamoring for answers. Melanie Jacobs stood on the steps, her face grim as she addressed the restless crowd. "I know you're all afraid and angry," she said, her voice carrying over the murmurs. "But we can't let this tear us apart. We need to come together, to support each other and demand justice for the victims." In the crowd, faces etched with worry and grief nodded in agreement. Among them stood Sarah Novak, Maggie's teenage daughter. She had known Jonah from the local shelter, had seen the kindness in his eyes. The thought of what he had endured filled her with a righteous fury. "We can't let Henshaw get away with this," Sarah called out, her voice trembling with emotion. "We have to make sure he pays for what he's done." A chorus of voices rose in agreement, the anger and determination palpable. Melanie held up her hands, calling for calm. "The authorities are doing everything they can to build a case against Henshaw," she said. "But we have a part to play, too. We need to be there for each other, to show the world that Millfield is stronger than one man's evil." As the crowd dispersed, Sarah felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see her mother, her eyes soft with understanding. "I'm proud of you," Maggie said, pulling her daughter into a hug. "Your father would be too." Sarah nodded, blinking back tears. Her father, a police officer, had died in the line of duty when she was just a child. She had grown up with a fierce sense of right and wrong, a determination to make a difference in the world. "I want to help," she said, her voice steady. "I want to do something to make this right." Maggie smiled, her own eyes glistening. "I have an idea," she said. "Come on." Daniel and Elena huddled in a dingy motel room on the outskirts of town. The files spread out on the bed between them. They had been driving for hours, taking back roads and switching cars to throw off any potential pursuers. Elena rubbed her temples, fighting off a headache. "We can't keep running forever," she said. "We need to find a way to expose Henshaw, to make sure he can't hurt anyone else." Daniel nodded, his jaw set with determination. "I think I know where we need to start," he said, pulling out a file. Jonah mentioned a hidden lab in the hospital, somewhere in the abandoned East Wing. "If we can find it, get evidence of what Henshaw was doing." Elena's eyes widened. "We could blow this whole thing wide open." Daniel stood, crossing to the window and peering out through the faded curtains. "It won't be easy," he said. "Henshaw will have his goons watching the hospital, waiting for us to make a move." Elena rose, joining him at the window. "Then we'll need backup," she said. "Someone we can trust." Daniel turned to her, his expression serious. "I think I know who to call." Across town, in the woods behind the empty warehouse, Officer Sam Carter watched as a team of crime scene technicians combed the area around Dr. Patel's body. He had called in every favor he could, making sure the investigation was handled by people he trusted. Detective Lena Alvarez, a sharp-eyed woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, stood beside him, her arms folded. "What have we got?" she asked, her voice low. Sam handed her the blood-stained journal. "Looks like Patel was a whistleblower," he said. "He was going to expose Henshaw and paid the price." Alvarez flipped through the pages, her frown deepening. "This is big," she murmured. "Bigger than anything we've ever dealt with." Sam nodded, his hand resting on Max's head. "We're going to need every scrap of evidence we can get," he said. "And someone on the inside." Alvarez eyed him. "Your old partner? Cross?" Sam smiled ruefully. He always did have a knack for getting into places he wasn't supposed to. As the sun began to set over Millfield, the stage was set for a final confrontation. The truth was close, so close they could almost taste it. But Henshaw still had one last trick up his sleeve. The hospital was quiet, the halls deserted save for the occasional nurse on night rounds. Daniel and Elena moved silently through the shadows, their hearts pounding in their chests. They had made it inside, thanks to a diversion provided by Sam and Alvarez. The detective had staged a raid on Henshaw's house, drawing the doctor and his men away from the hospital. It was a risky gamble, but it had paid off. Now, Daniel and Elena crept towards the abandoned East Wing, following the schematics they had memorized. The air grew colder as they moved deeper into the bowels of the hospital, the walls damp with neglect. At last, they came to a heavy metal door, rusted with age. Daniel pulled out a set of lock picks, his fingers working deftly in the dim light. With a soft click, the door swung open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. Elena swallowed hard, her hand finding Daniel's in the gloom. Together, they descended into the unknown, the smell of chemicals and decay growing stronger with each step. At the bottom, they found themselves in a long, low-ceilinged room, lit by flickering fluorescent bulbs. The walls were lined with cages, some still containing the remains of animals in various stages of decay. In the center of the room, a row of metal examination tables gleamed dully, their surfaces stained with dark, rusty splotches. Elena's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. "Oh my God!" she whispered. "What was he doing down here?" Daniel moved forward, his jaw clenched tight. He pulled out a camera, documenting the evidence with grim determination. "We have to get this to the authorities," he said. "This is the proof we need to put Henshaw away for good." But as they turned to leave, a sound from the far end of the room made them freeze. A low, pained moan, coming from a shadowed alcove. Elena and Daniel exchanged a glance, dread rising in their throats. They moved forward cautiously, their hearts pounding in their ears. And there, huddled in the dark, they found a figure in a tattered hospital gown. A man, emaciated and trembling, his eyes hollow with suffering. "Please," he whispered, his voice ragged. "Help me." The sun rose over Millfield, casting a pale light over the quiet streets. In the abandoned East Wing of Broadview Hospital, a team of law enforcement officers moved through the halls, their faces grim. Detective Alvarez led the way, her gun drawn. Beside her, Officer Carter and Max followed close behind, the dog's ears pricked with anticipation. They had received the call just an hour before, a frantic message from Daniel. He and Elena had found Henshaw's hidden lab, along with a survivor of the doctor's twisted experiments. They needed backup and fast. As they approached the heavy metal door, Alvarez signaled for the team to take positions. With a nod, she kicked the door open, the sound echoing through the empty corridors. They moved down the stairs, flashlights cutting through the gloom. At the bottom, they fanned out, securing the room with practiced efficiency. And then, in the far corner, they found them, Daniel and Elena, crouched beside the huddled figure of a man. His skin stretched tight over his bones. He blinked up at them, his eyes filled with a desperate hope. Alvarez holstered her gun, kneeling down beside them. "We're here to help," she said softly. "You're safe now." As the officers moved to assist the survivor, Daniel stood, his face etched with exhaustion and relief. "Henshaw?" he asked. Alvarez shook her head. "Still in the wind, but we've got an APB out on him. He won't get far." Elena looked around the lab, her eyes haunted. "All this suffering," she murmured. "All this pain. And for what?" Daniel placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression hardening. "We'll find him," he said, "and we'll make sure he pays for what he's done." As the team began to process the scene, gathering the damning evidence that would seal Henshaw's fate, a sense of grim determination settled over them. They had uncovered a great evil, but they had also seen the strength and resilience of the human spirit. And they knew that, no matter how dark the road ahead might be, they would face it together. Sarah Novak stood in the center of Millfield Park, a megaphone clutched in her hand. Around her, a sea of faces looked up, their expressions a mix of anger, grief, and determination. In the days since the truth about Henshaw's crimes had come to light, the community had rallied around the survivors, offering support and solidarity in the face of unimaginable trauma. Vigils had been held, memorials erected, and funds raised to help those in need. But Sarah knew that the fight was far from over. Henshaw was still out there, and the system that had allowed his crimes to go unchecked for so long remained in place. She had organized this rally to demand change, to ensure that nothing like this could ever happen again. "We are here today because we refuse to be silent," Sarah said, her voice ringing out across the park. "We refuse to let the actions of one man define us, to let fear and hatred win out over compassion and justice." The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices rising as one. Sarah felt a swell of pride in her chest, a sense of purpose that had been growing steadily since that fateful day in the library. She looked out over the sea of faces, picking out familiar ones in the crowd. There was her mother, beaming with pride. Officer Carter and Max, standing tall in their uniforms. Melanie Jacobs, her pen flying across her notepad as she documented the historic moment. And there, at the edge of the crowd, Sarah spotted a face she had not seen in years. A face that had haunted her dreams, a reminder of the father she had lost too soon. Daniel Cross, his arm around Elena Morales, met her gaze across the distance. He nodded slowly, a gesture of respect and acknowledgement. Sarah swallowed hard, fighting back the sudden sting of tears. She turned back to the microphone, her voice steady and clear. "We are Millfield," she said, "and we will not be broken." As the crowd rose to its feet, their voices joining as one, Sarah knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be. A leader, a fighter, a beacon of hope in a world that so desperately needed it. Dr. Victor Henshaw raced down a deserted highway, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. In the passenger seat, A duffel bag bulged with cash and forged documents, the tools of a man on the run. He had been so close, so dangerously close to achieving his life's work. The discoveries he had made, the breakthroughs that had been within his grasp, all of it, ruined by the meddling of a few insignificant fools. But he was not beaten yet. He had contingency plans, bolt holes scattered across the country. He would start again, rebuild his research from scratch. And this time he would not be stopped. A sudden flash of red and blue in the rearview mirror made his heart seize in his chest. He glanced back, his eyes widening at the sight of the police cruiser bearing down on him, its sirens blaring. He floored the accelerator, the car lurching forward with a roar of the engine. But it was too late. The cruiser pulled alongside him, the officer gesturing for him to pull over. With a snarl of rage, Henshaw jerked the wheel, sending his car careening off the road and into the dense woods beyond. The cruiser followed, its tires kicking up plumes of dirt and leaves. Henshaw raced through the trees, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind him, he could hear the baying of a dog, the shouts of the pursuing officer. And then, in a sudden, sickening lurch, the ground gave way beneath his feet. He tumbled forward, his body slamming against rock and root as he rolled down a steep embankment. He came to rest at the bottom, his body battered and bruised. He tried to rise, but a searing pain in his leg made him cry out in agony. A shadow fell across him, and he looked up to see the German Shepherd looming over him, its teeth bared in a snarl. And behind the dog, the grim face of Officer Sam Carter. "Victor Henshaw," Carter said, his voice cold with contempt. "You are under arrest for the murder of Dr. Patel, and for the torture and illegal experimentation on human subjects." As Carter read him his rights, Henshaw felt a dull sense of inevitability settle over him. It was over. His life's work, his grand ambitions, all of it had come to nothing. And as he was led away in handcuffs, he could not help but wonder at the strange twists of fate that had brought him to this moment. The arrogance that had been his undoing, the hubris that had blinded him to the consequences of his actions. In the end, it had not been his brilliance that had defined him but his cruelty, and that, he knew, would be his legacy. The trial of Dr. Victor Henshaw was a media sensation, drawing reporters from across the country to the small town of Millfield. For weeks, the world watched as the horrifying details of his crimes were laid bare, the survivors of his experiments bravely taking the stand to tell their stories. Through it all, the community of Millfield stood strong, united in their determination to see justice done. They packed the courtroom each day, offering silent support to the brave men and women who had suffered so much at Henshaw's hands. And when the verdict was read, the cheers that erupted from the courthouse steps could be heard for miles around. Guilty on all counts, the judge declared, his voice ringing with righteous fury. Henshaw would spend the rest of his life behind bars, a fitting punishment for a man who had shown no mercy, no compassion for his fellow human beings. In the days and weeks that followed, the town of Millfield began to heal. The hospital was shut down, its doors closed forever. In its place, a new clinic was built, staffed by doctors and nurses who had dedicated their lives to the service of others. Elena Morales was offered a position as head nurse, her bravery and compassion an inspiration to all who knew her. Daniel Cross, his faith in the justice system restored, returned to the police force, determined to make a difference in the lives of the vulnerable and the forgotten. Officer Sam Carter and Max became local heroes, their tireless work in bringing Henshaw to justice a shining example of the power of persistence and integrity. And Melanie Jacobs, her reporting on the case earning her national acclaim, used her newfound platform to shed light on the injustices that so often went unnoticed in the world. But perhaps the most profound change of all was the one that took place in the hearts and minds of the people of Millfield themselves. They had faced a great darkness, a terrible evil that had threatened to tear their community apart. But in the end, they had emerged stronger, more united than ever before. They had learned that true strength came not from power or wealth or status, but from the bonds of love and compassion that held them together. They had learned that even in the face of the greatest adversity, hope could never be extinguished, as long as there were those willing to stand up and fight for what was right. And so, as the sun rose over Millfield, casting its warm light over the quiet streets and the green fields beyond, the town began to move forward, forever changed by the trials they had endured. They would never forget the pain and the sorrow of those dark days, but they would also never forget the strength and the resilience that had carried them through. For they were Millfield, and they would not be broken. Not by the actions of one man, not by the darkness that lurked in the shadows of the world. They would stand together, united in their determination to build a brighter future, a world where compassion and justice reigned supreme. And in that moment, as the birds sang in the trees and the laughter of children filled the air, they knew that they had already won.